a lavish estate in a crumbling empire. The wedding of Lord Cassian and Lady Morel is the event of the season opulence. Politics and hidden agendas swirl beneath the golden chandeliers. In the kitchen below, a slave cook named Elion prepares. The feast, his hands steady, his heart burning. Elian was once a renowned chef in his homeland, before being captured and enslaved by Cassian's forces during a brutal conquest. For years, he's cooked for the very man who destroyed his village and slaughtered his family. Now, Cassian marries into a powerful family to secure his political future, and Elion is tasked with preparing the wedding feast. But Elion has been planning. Each dish is a symbol, each flavor a memory. The final course, a blood-red dessert infused with a rare toxin, is served with elegance and precision. As guests indulge, the poison begins to take effect. Cassian collapses first. Panic erupts. Elion stands silently, watching the chaos unfold, his revenge complete. Yet he does not flee. He walks into the center of the hall, blood-stained apron and all, and delivers a chilling speech, not of madness, but of memory, justice, and the cause to forgetting. You called it a celebration. I called it a funeral for the last shred of mercy I had left. The moment I saw the invitations gilded in gold, bearing your name beside hers, I knew the world had twisted itself into a grotesque parody of justice. You, the butcher of my village, now cloaked in silken ceremony, parading your union as a triumph of legacy. But I saw through the lace and laughter. I saw the ghosts you buried beneath your empire, and tonight I invited them to dine. You dressed the hall in white, as if purity could be conjured by fabric. But I know what white hides, the blood that's been scrubbed from the marble floors, the screams muffled behind velvet curtains. I've walked these corridors for years, carrying platters of indulgence to men who never tasted consequence. I've watched you toast victories carved from the bones of the forgotten, and every time I stirred your soup, I imagined stirring the ashes of my home. You called me cook, as if that name erased the man I was. You never asked what I once created, only what I could replicate. You taught me to measure, to serve, to smile. But you never taught me how to forget. So I remembered. I remembered the scent of my mother's bread, the laughter of my brother as he stole herbs from my garden, the way my father's hands trembled when he taught me to slice with reverence. You took all of it, and tonight I gave it back in, the only language you've taught me to speak. You see, mercy is a fragile thing. It lives in the quiet corners of the soul, where hope still flickers. I kept mine alive longer than you deserved. I fed it scraps of memory, watered it with restraint. But mercy cannot survive in chains. It rots, it curdles, and when it dies, it leaves behind something colder than vengeance, clarity. I did not act out of rage. I acted because mercy had no place left to live. You laughed tonight. I watched you from the shadows as you raised your glass, oblivious to the storm beneath your tongue. You kissed your bride with the same lips that ordered the slaughter of mine. You danced, you sang, and all the while the poison bloomed inside you like a second heart. I timed it perfectly, not for pain, but for poetry. You always loved theatrics. I thought you'd appreciate the symmetry. The guests will say, I snapped, that grief twisted me into a monster. Let them. They never saw the slow erosion, the daily humiliation, the way you made me serve your joy while swallowing my own sorrow. They never saw the ledger I kept, not of ingredients, but of indignities. Every insult, every command, Every time you made me kneel while you feasted, I recorded it all. And tonight I cooked from that book. You called it a celebration. I called it a reckoning. The chandeliers above us glittered like stars, but I know stars are just burning things pretending to be beautiful. Just like you, just like this empire. You built it on suffering, and tonight I made you taste it. Not in bitterness. No, I'm more refined than that. I flavored your death with sweetness, with nostalgia, with the very spices you praised me for. You died loving the dish that killed you. I did not cry, I did not scream. I simply watched as your body betrayed you, as your guests turned from laughter to horror. Watched as the illusion cracked, and in that moment I felt nothing, not triumph, not relief, just silence, the kind that follows a storm, the kind that lingers when the truth has finally spoken. You called it a celebration. I called it a funeral. Not just for you, but for the man I used to be. The man who believed that survival meant submission. That endurance was enough, but endurance is not justice. And tonight, I buried that man beneath your feast. I buried him with every bite. You took every toast you made. He is gone, and what remains is not a slave, not a cook, but a witness. Every spice I used tonight was once grown in the soil of my homeland. The same soil your boots crushed. You tasted saffron tonight, didn't you? That golden thread that danced across your tongue, subtle and warm. It used to grow wild in the hills behind my father's house, where the wind carried stories and the earth remembered names. You ground it into powder, stripped it of its origin, and called it exotic. But it was never yours to name. The cumin in your stew, sharp, earthy, familiar, was harvested by my mother's hands. She used to sing as she worked, her voice rising with the sun, falling with the dusk. You never heard that song. You only heard the clink of coins when you bought the spice in bulk, never wondering who planted it, who wept over it, who died defending it. Tonight I made you eat her memory. I folded it into the broth like a secret, and you swallowed it without question. You praised the complexity of the flavors, the way they lingered. But complexity is born from pain. The cardamom you adored was once traded for protection, a desperate bargain made by my people when your soldiers came. We gave you our harvest so you'd spare our children. You took the spice and slaughtered the children anyway. I roasted it tonight, just enough to release its bitterness. I wanted you to taste the betrayal, the cinnamon in your dessert, sweet, fragrant, comforting, was once a symbol of peace. We used it in rituals, in weddings, in births. It marked beginnings. You used it to mark your end. I ground it myself, slowly, deliberately, remembering the way my sister used to braid it into her hair before festivals. She died with ash in her lungs and cinnamon on her scalp. I served it to you with a smile. You always asked me where I learned to cook like this. You said I had a gift, but gifts are not born, they are inherited. My grandmother taught me how to balance heat and sweetness, how to coax flavor from silence. She taught me that food is memory, and memory is resistance. You thought you were eating a meal. You were eating a lineage. You were devouring the ghosts of my bloodline. The turmeric in your rice, vibrant, golden, healing, was once used to treat wounds. We believed it could draw out poison, purify the body. Tonight, I used it to mask the toxin. I thought it poetic. You consumed what you believed would protect you, and it betrayed you, just as you betrayed us. The irony was not lost on me. I watched you savor it, watched you trust it. That trust was my final ingredient. You complemented the balance, the harmony. But harmony is a lie told by conquerors. There is no balance in chains. There is only silence and survival. I used coriander tonight, delicate, citrusy, fleeting. It reminded me of the last spring before the invasion, when the fields bloomed and we believed in tomorrow. You destroyed that tomorrow. I plated it for you with precision, so you could taste what you took. You said the flavors were nostalgic. I wonder whose nostalgia you imagined, yours, mine. The nostalgia of a stolen culture, repackaged for your pleasure. You called it fusion. I call it theft. The nutmeg in your wine was once currency in my village. We traded it for stories, for songs, for safety. You traded it for power. I infused it into your drink so you could toast your own undoing. You never asked where the spices came from. You never asked who grew them, who bled for them. You only asked for more flavor, more indulgence, more spectacle, and I gave it to you. I gave you everything you asked for, wrapped in the very essence of what you destroyed. You dined on the ruins of my world, and you called it exquisite. Every spice I used tonight was once grown in the soil of my homeland, the same soil your boots crushed, and tonight it rose to crush you back. You taught me to cook with precision. I learned to kill with grace. That was your first lesson, wasn't it? Not in words, but in expectations. You demanded perfection in every dish, not just flavor, but symmetry, timing, presentation. A misplaced garnish was a sin, a lukewarm plate, a crime. I absorbed your rules like scripture, not because I admired you, but because I knew that survival depended on obedience. You called it discipline. I called it rehearsal. You watched me closely in those early years, not as a mentor, but as a predator, sizing up his prey. You tested me with impossible menus, with last-minute changes, with guests who judged my work without ever knowing my name. I passed every test, not because I wanted your approval, but because I needed your silence. Every compliment you gave was a leash, every nod a chain. I wore them like armor, waiting for the day I'd forge them into blades. You taught me how to slice without waste, how to balance acidity with sweetness, how to layer flavor so subtly it lingered long after the meal was done. I listened, I learned, but while you taught me how to feed, I taught myself how to deceive. I studied toxins the way I studied spices. I memorized the way bitterness could be masked, how heat could amplify absorption. You thought I was mastering cuisine. I was mastering consequence. You praised my plating, said I had an artist's. I do. But art is not always benign. Sometimes it's a weapon disguised as beauty. You never saw the way I arranged your meals like altars, each one a silent elegy to the lives you erased. You never noticed how the sauces bled across the porcelain like veins. You never tasted the grief I folded into the dough you consumed. It all blind to the ritual. You taught me timing, how to serve the main course just as the wine reached its peak, how to pace the meal so conversation flowed. I applied that same timing to your death. The poison bloomed exactly when the music swelled, when the guests were distracted by laughter. You collapsed between courses, just as I planned. It was elegant, it was seamless. You always said a good meal should tell a story. Tonight it told yours. You taught me restraint, how to hold back just enough salt, just enough heat, to leave the palate wanting more. I used that restraint in my revenge. I didn't scream, I didn't rush. I let the silence speak. I let the flavors do the talking. You died with a smile on your lips, mistaking the numbness for satisfaction that was my final seasoning. Ambiguity, you never knew what hit you. That was the grace you taught me. You taught me how to serve without being seen. I used that invisibility to move freely, to plan without suspicion. I became part of the architecture, a fixture, a shadow. You never imagined the cook could be the executioner. That was your mistake. You underestimated the quiet ones. You thought power only wore crowns. But I wore an apron, and tonight it was soaked in justice. You taught me how to anticipate, how to read a guest's mood, how to adjust a dish mid-preparation to suit their whims. I used that anticipation to read your weaknesses. I knew your favorite flavors, your allergies, your habits. I knew when you'd be distracted, when you'd be vulnerable. You gave me the tools. I simply repurposed them. You built the stage. I rewrote the script. You taught me to cook with precision. I learned to kill with grace. And tonight, you tasted both. You feasted on my silence for years. Tonight, I serve you my voice. You never asked me to speak, and I never dared to interrupt. In your world, silence was obedience, and obedience was survival. I learned early that words had weight, and in your halls, they crushed the wrong speaker. So I swallowed mine. I buried them beneath recipes and rituals, beneath the clatter of pans and the hiss of boiling water. You mistook that silence for peace. It was never peace. It was pressure. You spoke endlessly about politics, conquest, legacy. Your voice filled every room like smoke, choking out dissent. I listened. I always listened. Not because I admired you, but because I had no choice. You spoke of your victories while I stirred your soup. You laughed about the lands you burned, while I plated your lamb. You never noticed the way my hands trembled when you mentioned my homeland. You never noticed anything that didn't flatter you. You feasted on my silence, but it wasn't passive, it was curated. I chose every moment to hold my tongue, every glance to lower my eyes. I became fluent in invisibility. You thought I was docile. I was documenting every insult, every oversight, every time you called me boy instead of man. I recorded it all, not in ink, but in memory. And tonight, I recited it in flavor. My voice is in the bitterness of your wine, the sharpness of your stew, the final sweetness of your death. You never knew what I sounded like. Isn't that strange? A man who served you for years, whose hands fed your guests, whose sweat seasoned your celebrations, and you never once asked what my voice carried. You knew my skills, but not my soul. You knew my recipes, but not my rage. You knew my silence, but not its source. Tonight, you heard it. Not in words, but in consequence. You feasted on my silence, and I let you, because silence gave me access. It let me move unnoticed, let me plan uninterrupted. You never feared the quiet ones. You feared rebellion, not reflection. You feared swords, not spoons. But silence is a blade, too slow, sharp, patient. I honed mine for years, waiting for the moment it could cut clean. Tonight, it did. You taught me that words were dangerous. You punished those who spoke out. I saw what happened to the maid who cried too loudly, to the stable boy who questioned your orders. I learned that silence was safer. But safety is not the same as dignity, and dignity, once denied long enough, becomes something else. It becomes a voice that no longer asks to be heard, it demands it. You feasted on my silence, and I let you believe it was loyalty. You toasted me once, remember? Said I was the quiet genius behind the feast. I smiled, I bowed, I returned to the kitchen, but inside I was boiling, not with anger, with clarity. You saw my silence as submission. I saw it as strategy. You gave me no platform, so I built one from your bones. You never imagined I had something to say. That's the cruelty of power. It assumes silence equals emptiness, but I was never empty. I was overflowing with grief, with memory, with stories you tried to erase. You dined on my labor, but tonight you choked on my truth, and it was seasoned perfectly. You feasted on my silence for years. Tonight I serve you my voice, and it is not gentle. It is not polite. It does not ask for permission. It arrives, like fire, like thunder, like the reckoning you never saw coming. This poison is not just for your body, it's for your legacy. You always feared death, but only in the way vain men do. The loss of breath, the fading of flesh, you never feared. What comes after the unraveling of myth, the erosion of memory? You spent years building a name that would outlive you, carving your initials into stone, into treaties, into the mouths of those too afraid to speak the truth. But tonight, I've laced your legacy with rot. You thought legacy was armor, that once you were gone, your deeds would be polished and paraded by those who inherited your power. But legacies are fragile things. They depend on silence, on complicity, on the absence of contradiction. And I am contradiction incarnate. I am the footnote you tried to erase, the whisper that refuses to die. This poison will not only still your heart, it will stain your story. You built monuments to yourself, didn't you? Statues, portraits, songs commissioned to sing your victories. But what good is a statue when the people spit at its feet? What good is a song when the melody curdles with truth? I've poisoned a feast, yes, but I've also poisoned the narrative. Your guests will not remember your wedding as a union of dynasties. They will remember it as a reckoning, a collapse, a curse. This poison is slow, deliberate. It mimics elegance. Just like you, it doesn't scream, it whispers, it doesn't mutilate, it seduces. And that's what makes it perfect. You always wanted to be remembered as refined, as cultured. So I gave you a death that mirrors your vanity. You'll die with a wine glass in hand, surrounded by silk and song, and every detail will become a grotesque parody of the legacy you tried to craft. You taught your scribes to write history in your favor. You paid poets to immortalize your triumphs. But history is not written in ink alone. It's written in blood, in rumor, in the trembling voices of survivors. And I am a survivor. I will speak. I will tell them what you did, what you took, what you buried beneath your banquet halls, and they will listen. Because your death will make them curious, and curiosity is the first crack in the monument. This poison is not just for your body, it's for the stories they tell about you. It will infect every retelling, every eulogy, every attempt to paint you as noble. They'll hesitate, they'll wonder, they'll ask questions, and questions are dangerous things. They unravel certainty, they breed dissent. You ruled through certainty. I've replaced it with doubt. You always feared obscurity more than death. You feared being forgotten, being reduced to a footnote in someone else's tale. But obscurity is mercy. I will not grant you that. You will be remembered, but not as a hero, as a warning. as a man who mistook cruelty for strength, who mistook silence for loyalty, who mistook a cook for a servant. Your name will echo, yes, but in shame. This poison is layered. It doesn't just kill, it reveals. It strips away the illusion. Your guests will see you not as a groom, but as a tyrant brought low by the very hands that fed him. They will see the symbolism in every bite, every flavor, every moment of collapse, and they will carry that symbolism with them. It will haunt their palates. It will linger in their dreams. You thought legacy was something you could control, but legacy is not built, it's bestowed. It's shaped by those who remember you, not those who obeyed you. And I am no longer obedient. I am the architect of your afterlife, and I've seasoned it with truth. This poison is not just for your body, it's for your legacy, and it has already begun to spread. I am not a monster. I am a mirror. Look into me and see what you made. You want to call me mad, unhinged, broken by grief. But madness implies chaos, and there was nothing chaotic about tonight. Every movement was measured, every flavor calibrated, every death timed. To the rhythm of your own arrogance, monsters devour without thought. I served with intention. That difference matters. You shaped me, not with kindness, not with mentorship, but with neglect, with humiliation, with the slow erosion of identity. You stripped me of my name, my history, my voice, and then expected me to remain hollow. But hollowness is not emptiness. It is space, and space can be filled. You filled me with your cruelty, your condescension, your belief that I was beneath you. Tonight, I returned the favor. You want to believe I was born this way, that something in me was always twisted. It's easier that way, isn't it? To see me as an aberration, a flaw in the system. But I was not born in darkness. I was dragged into it, by your hands, by your orders, by your laughter echoing through the halls while I scrubbed blood from the kitchen tiles. You fed me silence and called it peace. I fed you poison and called it truth. I am not a monster. I am a reflection. You taught me to smile while suffering. You taught me to bow while burning. You taught me that survival required performance. So I performed. I became the cook you praised, the servant you trusted, the shadow you ignored. And in that shadow I grew teeth, not to bite, but to speak. And tonight my voice was sharp enough to cut. You want to call me evil, but evil is a luxury of the powerful. You committed atrocities and called them strategy. You enslaved and called it order. You silenced and called it tradition. I did one thing, one act of rebellion, and suddenly I am the villain. But villains are born from stories like yours. I am not the beginning. I am the consequence. Looked into my eyes for years and saw nothing. That was your mistake. You thought emptiness meant safety, but emptiness is where fire hides before it finds oxygen. You gave me oxygen, with every insult, with every command, with every time you made me serve your joy while swallowing my own sorrow. You lit the flame. I simply let it burn. I am not a monster. I am a mirror, and mirrors do not lie. They reflect, they reveal, they force confrontation. You looked into me and saw a servant. But tonight, you saw yourself, stripped of titles, stripped of power, stripped of illusion. You saw the man beneath the silk, and he was trembling. You want to believe this was about revenge, but revenge is personal. This was not personal. This was historical. This was ancestral. This was the echo of every voice you silenced, every life you erased, every truth you buried beneath your empire. I am not just one man, I am many. I am the sum of your sins. You called me loyal, you called me gifted, you called me yours, but I was never yours. I was watching, I was remembering, I was waiting. And now, in your final moments, you see me not as a cook, not as a slave, but as a reckoning. That is the power of reflection. It does not ask for permission. It simply shows, I am not a monster. I am a mirror. And tonight, you saw your own face, and it was not beautiful. I am not a monster. I am a mirror. Look into me and see what you made. You want to believe I emerged from darkness, that I was born twisted, that this act was inevitable. But monsters are born in isolation. I was sculpted by your hands, your rules, your gaze that never saw me as whole. You fed me silence, and I grew teeth. You fed me obedience, and I grew eyes. You fed me shame, and I grew memory. You called me loyal, you called me gifted, you called me yours, but I was never yours. I was watching, I was listening. I was absorbing every moment you mistook cruelty for culture. You thought refinement could mask brutality. You thought etiquette could erase history. But I remembered everything. And tonight, I plated that memory with precision. You want to call me evil, but evil is a luxury of the powerful. You committed atrocities and called them strategy. You enslaved and called it order. You silenced and called it tradition. I did one thing, one act of rebellion, and suddenly I am the villain. But villains are born from stories like yours. I am not the beginning. I am the consequence. You looked into my eyes for years and saw nothing. That was your mistake. You thought emptiness meant safety. But emptiness is where fire hides before. It finds oxygen. You gave me oxygen with every insult, with every command, with every time you made me serve your joy while swallowing my own sorrow. You lit the flame. I simply let it burn. I am not a monster. I am a reflection. You taught me to smile while suffering. You taught me to bow while burning. You taught me that survival required performance. So I performed. I became the cook you praised, the servant you trusted, the shadow you ignored. And in that shadow I grew sharp, not to wound, but to reveal. You want to believe this was about revenge, but revenge is personal. This was not personal. This was historical. This was ancestral. This was the echo of every voice you silenced, every life you erased, every truth you buried beneath your empire. I am not just one man, I am many. I am the sum of your sins. You built a world where silence was currency. I paid with it for years. But silence accrues interest. It compounds, it grows heavy. And when it breaks, it does not whisper, it roars. Tonight, you heard that roar, not in words, but in collapse. In the way your guests gasped, in the way your bride screamed, in the way your legacy cracked. You taught me to serve without being seen. I used that invisibility to become your undoing. You never feared the quiet ones. You feared rebellion, not reflection. You feared swords, not spoons. But reflection is sharper than steel. It shows you what you are, not what you pretend to be. And tonight, you saw yourself. You called me a cook. I became a witness. You called me a slave. I became a sentence. You called me nothing. I became the ending of your story, not with fury, not with chaos, but with clarity, with grace. with the same elegance you demanded from me, turned against you. I am not a monster. I am a mirror. And tonight you saw your own face, and it was not beautiful. You dressed me in chains and called it tradition. I dressed your death in velvet and called it art. That's how you justified it, wasn't it? The shackles, the silence, the servitude, all wrapped in ceremony, all cloaked in custom. You said it was the way things had always been. You said it was order, but tradition is just cruelty with a crown. And tonight I returned the favor with elegance. You made me part of the decor, a fixture, a background element. I was the quiet rhythm beneath your celebrations, the invisible pulse behind your pleasure. You never saw me as a man. You saw me as a role, a function, a tool. You called it honor to serve in your house, to cook for your guests. But honor without freedom is theater, and I learned to perform. You taught me that beauty could be weaponized, that silk could hide scars, that gold could blind the guilty. So I studied your aesthetic. I learned your language. I mastered your rituals, and then I rewrote them. I plated your final meal with precision, with symmetry, with grace. You died in a room that sparkled. You died surrounded by applause. You died inside the illusion you built. You dressed me in chains, but I learned how to move in them. I learned how to make silence look like serenity. I learned how to make submission look like skill. You thought I was grateful. I was gathering. Every compliment you gave was a thread. Every command, a stitch. And tonight, I wove your ending into a tapestry of taste and timing. You always said presentation mattered, that the eye must feast before the tongue. So I made your death beautiful. I made it cinematic. I made it unforgettable. The velvet drapes, the candlelight, the crimson glaze on the final dish. You thought it was indulgence. It was indictment. You thought it was celebration. It was sentence. You called your customs sacred. I called them suffocating. You called your rules refined. I called them rot. But I played along. I wore the uniform. I followed the choreography. I became the perfect servant. And then, when the moment was right, I turned the stage into a grave. Not with violence, with elegance, with art. You dressed me in chains and called it tradition. I wore them like costume. I danced in them. I cooked in them. I smiled in them, and you applauded. You never saw the cracks. You never saw the rebellion stitched into the seams. You never saw the blade hidden in the bouquet. That was your blindness. That was my canvas. You always admired my plating, said I had an artist's touch. You were right, but art is not always benign. Sometimes it's a mirror. Sometimes it's a wound. Sometimes it's a reckoning wrapped in beauty. Tonight, you tasted that reckoning, and you called it divine. You thought you were the patron. I was the performer. But performers choose their finales. And mine was not applause. It was silence. The kind that follows revelation. The kind that lingers in the throat. The kind that stains memory. You dressed me in chains and called it tradition. I dressed your death in velvet and called it art, and the audience never saw the difference. Let the guests remember this night, not for love, but for truth. They came dressed in silk and expectation, ready to witness a union they believed would shape the future. They toasted to legacy, to lineage, to the merging of power. But power is not love, it is hunger, and tonight I fed that hunger its own. Reflection, not with fury, with flavor, not with violence, with vision. They will remember the music, yes, the way it swelled as the bride entered, the way it faltered when the groom collapsed. They will remember the scent of roasted lamb, the sweetness of the wine, the way the dessert shimmered like rubies. But beneath those memories will be something else, a question, a crack, a whisper that something was wrong. That beauty had teeth. Let them remember the way the candles flickered, the way the laughter turned to silence. Let them remember the moment the illusion broke, not with a scream, but with a gasp, not with blood, but with stillness. That is how truth arrives, not as spectacle, but as shift, as rupture, as the quiet realization that everything they believed was curated. They will speak of the bride, of her horror, of her tears,